You want to?
Okay, good evening, everybody. We are learning a Maamer. This Maamer was said by the previous Rebbe in 1943, and it's based on a part of the davening that I imagine everybody here is already familiar with. It's right in the very beginning in the Chabad Siddur, although in other communities they sing it at the end. And curiously, for reasons that we can speculate about, this tefillah, this man-written prayer, I mean, it's not a quote from the Chumash, has a great, quote, popularity. Every camp has numerous melodies that they sing this tefillah to. And in Hebrew, it is Adon Olam. So I imagine that many people here recognize it. Adon Olam, Asher Malach, Adon Olam, Asher Malach, Adon Olam, Asher Malach. And it's taken on a lot of popularity. Part of it is the cadence. If you look at each stanza, they begin with the same vowel. It has a certain rhythm to it. And again, it's a man-composed, authored, we call it a prayer. It's not a request, it's more of a statement, but it's part of our daily service. And in the Chabad Siddur, as we will make mention, it's right in the beginning, right after we begin with the morning blessings, which acknowledge the basic gifts that Hashem has brought to each of us through when we awaken each morning, and we are upright, and we are mobile, and we are visual, and we are functional, and sit down, make yourself comfortable, take a phone.
So English, you're in America.
We read this part of the davening. So here, for the people who are local, and I emailed it out, we copied the actual text of the prayer. Unfortunately, this Maamer is not, as far as I know, translated into English, so we're just going to work with the Hebrew. But just to get our bearings, this is the tefillah, and we're really going to focus on basically the first line. The first line reads, Adon Olam, Master of the Universe. And you recognize that first word because if you were to add the Y, Yud sound at the end of it, you would recognize it as Hashem's name. In modern Hebrew, it's the term for like sir or master or mister or something like that. So Adon Olam, Master of the Universe, Asher Malach, who was the king, or who reigned, as he translates, B'terem, prior to Kol Yitzur Nivra, the formation, the creation of any created being. Now, as we often do in our desire to overanalyze everything, we are going to study each word. We're going to pick apart each word. And again, it is a curiosity that you will hear this prayer or some form of it in basically every community. In every summer camp, they sing the song, Adon Olam Asher Malach. And as often is, when we read something, we hear it and we say, oh yeah, that makes sense. But then we like to pick it apart and we go, hey, this makes no sense at all. And then that opens up, like a great detective, we find something that is misaligned. And this gives us an opportunity for an insight that would have otherwise escaped our attention. Now, as another form of a sort of introduction, it's quite important that we talk about a concept which is going to be analyzed here, which is the idea called the Spherus. In English, you would spell that S-E-F-I-R-O-S, Spherus, Samach, Thei, Yud, Resh, Vav, Saf. The root of the word Spherus, you may recognize, is the same word for a story. Saper li sipor, tell me a story. It's also the word for counting. You may recognize like Spheras ha'omer, the counting of the Omer, which we do between Pesach and Shavuos. And it is the idea that, just as we would say in English, that I recount the events, I give detail and clarity. In fact, the word sphera also is like the English word sapphire, which is a clarity, and like the word sphere, which starts to put definition on that which is innately undefinable. Now, one of the gifts that Hasidic study presents to us is it gives us terminology with which to discuss the infinity of Hashem. And just as a moment of social commentary, this was not always so popular because there were those who said, you can't do that. You can't talk about Hashem like you talk about a person, like you talk about Hashem is infinite, which of course Hashem is. And just as we cannot say what God is, we can't say what God is not. You can't say that God is tall, and you can't say that God is infinite. Because by saying he's infinite, you're suggesting that he's not finite, which sounds like a lot of words, and it's semantics. We are certainly not anti-semantic, and yet we don't have this type of limitation where we can say that God is not something. So along comes, not really original with Hasidus, but Hasidus brought it to the masses, that in Kabbalistic writings, or as we call it in Jewish mysticism, you get an opportunity to start to put some definition on the otherwise infinite characteristics of Hashem. These are called the Spherus. And they're not random. It's based on a pasuk. It's a pasuk you'll recognize because it's incorporated in the daily davening. It originates from Divrei Hayamim, called Chronicles in English, and we read it every day in the davening. We read it every day in the davening. We also read it when we take out the Torah, and you'll recognize we say, L'cha Hashem, HaGedula, HaGevura, HaTiferes. We list out 7 different characteristics that Hashem associates himself with. We have to real delve in. What's that?
You can't mute us.
If anyone wants to say something, feel free to unmute yourself and jump in, but I just muted everybody because otherwise you get a lot of background noise. But I can always mute you again. So
you mentioned that we say Adon Olam in the morning. Do we also say it on Shabbat morning?
We say it every morning, every day, Yom Kippur, Shabbos, Tuesday, every day of the year. It's a part of the davening. Shabbat Siddur, I think it's page 10 or 11 in the standard print of the Hebrew English Siddur. The Hebrew English Siddur. I think it's like page 10 or 11, something like that. So the Spherus, sorry?
12.
Page 12. The Spherus give us a mechanism with which we can talk about Hashem. Now, the same is true with people. I mean, we can talk about somebody, but it's not the essence of their identity. I tell you that somebody favorite ice cream or their profession or their hobbies or where they were born, it is true about them, although it does not capture their essence. This is why the pasuk says, L'cha Hashem. It's what you associate with. To the point we can't even really technically say that God is nice, because God does whatever he wants. He has no nature, but he associates himself with certain characteristics. Now, within these spheres, and this is still on the introductory level, and I apologize if this is too elementary and people already recognize this, but I think it's worthwhile to talk about it in advance, and then when we see it in the Maamer, it won't be so overwhelming. So as I mentioned to you, there are these 7 identifiable characteristics that Hashem associates himself with. And we have a structure for them, and they interplay with one another. And this is constantly emphasized, that we, when we say that we are created in the image of God, it doesn't mean that God has a 5-fingered fleshy thing at the end of his wrist. It means that God has impressed within our neshama these 7 characteristics that are identifiable. And there's various ways that they can be combined. We also talk about the 3 of the intellect. That will come across at other points. But what's directly relevant here is that each one of the first 6 of those 7 are sort of adjectives. That is, they're descriptions of certain character traits. The first one, for example, is kindness, or as it's probably more literally translated, limitlessness. Limitlessness, or as we would call it in practice, kindness, is not necessarily a description of my behavior. Meaning, if I think of myself or another person as being kind, that is not a description of what they're doing at this moment. That's a description of who they are. Mm-hmm. And the classic illustration of that idea is Avram Avinu. We just had it in the parsha a couple of weeks ago. You recall that after he had the bris milah at age 99, he was eager to perform the mitzvah of welcoming guests. This was very important. It was so important that it pained him that he didn't have the opportunity to offer kindness to guests. That means his chesed, his character of kindness, was present, although there was no one to offer kindness to at the moment, until Hashem dispatched these 3 people who we thought at first were travelers and turned out to be angels. Now, in this pantheon of spheres, of identifiable characteristics within Hashem or within us, we have on the, and I'll use this word very cautiously, on the bottom, we have the quality that is called malchus. Now, the word malchus, I don't have a good English word for it. It is the verb form of the word for king, meaning if presidents preside and governors govern, if we had a verb in English, which we don't, for what a king does, a king kings. Now we say reigns, rules, and so on. There is a little nuance that it has to be from the same word. So melech is a king, that's the noun. Malchus is the character of king. So it's royalty, it's the description of the law. Sorry. It's the description of the law that goes, et cetera, et cetera. That is the quality called Malchus. Malchus is, again, that quality of manifesting the king. Now, on the one hand, this quality of Malchus is called the bottom or the least evident, because if you imagine, I mean, it's hard for us a little bit, when the Tsar fell, which wasn't such a bad day in Jewish history, although what came after that, the communists, wasn't necessarily better, but there was one sort of nostalgia for the Tsar, because people understood the concept of royalty. We legally don't have royalty in this country, but we do socially, whether it's, not within the political realm, but people in industry or people who are so celebrated because of their accomplishment. We tend to poo-poo them and we want to knock them down and we berate them and we say, they're just phonies, and we try to knock them down. We've had a lot of bad experiences with kings too, so we don't like the idea. But if we could imagine genuinely a king, of course, among Chassidim, we point to the Rebbe, who's truly a king in that sense, not because he grabs power, not because he can fail you, but because of his personal character and the way in which he directs the community, which is purely voluntary, which is what makes it so meaningful, as opposed to the guy who has the power to lock you up or the power to pay you, and you obey him out of the fear of consequence. So the quality of Malchus, on the one hand, is a very shallow expression of who the king is. We presume the king, in our description of a real king, to be a man who is like Shaul HaMelech, King Saul, is described, literally head and shoulders above the people. He's not just one of the guys. And I know in America, we don't like that. We think of our presidents, and I get distracted that he comes home, kicks off his shoes, plays with the dog, watches Monday Night Football while he drinks a beer. He's just a regular guy. That is not what a king is. A king is innately, his character is distinct. Now, when the king issues a ruling, such as to put a stop sign on this corner, so we think, for that I need a king? I mean, it's so shallow. Now, of course, try living without stop signs. So on the one hand, the stop sign that is the most pragmatic aspect of the king is really very shallow relative to the very essence of who the king is. On the other hand, without it, you don't have much of a kingdom. You have chaos. So the quality of Malchus, which is where we're headed, carries with it this duality to it. Now, just to back up for a moment, as we described, that Malchus is at the bottom of the rank of the rung of the Spherus, of the illustration of the king. On the top of the Spherus, the top rung, is another term that you'll recognize being associated with royalty. It is what we call in Hebrew keser. Keser means the crown. Now, the function of a crown is not just to keep the king's head warm. The function of the crown is that the king understands that everything about him is subjected to what is embodied within this hat. And this hat embodies the kingdom, it embodies his personal family, and it weighs heavily on his head, not just as an adornment, to remind him of who he is. So if we were to use a simplistic, pragmatic illustration of this idea in our country, in the United States, the Keser of the United States, and again, we're not here to talk politics, the Keser of the United States is that all men are created equal. That is the ethos that directs every legal principle in this country. The pragmatism of that is that everybody has to stop at stop signs. And you don't get to say, well, I don't have to stop at stop signs. I'm famous, wealthy, connected and so. Now I know that we don't always get our kesser all the way down to our mom. You think about this in a family. What is the kesser of this family? What is the kesser of this institution? What is the kesser of this corporation? And the difference of success between one and another is not just how smart the CEO is, because you can be sure that the guy who runs General Motors also graduated first in his class from the Wharton School of Business. Why is it that his company is going under and the guy who runs Toyota is not? It's not about how smart the king is. It's not about even the kesser. It's how much can we bring the kesser into the malchus, right? So, I mean, again, I'm not here to talk about economics, but what's the difference between Kmart and Walmart? They both sell tennis balls. Because when you walk into Walmart, there's a greeter. So, but that's the lowliest thing. That's malchus. But somehow it's good, because then I said, what aisle is tennis balls? He says, aisle 14. And I buy the tennis balls. When I walk into Kmart, well, I got to wander around. I can't find it. I don't know where it is. And so if anybody here works for Kmart, don't be insulted.
Try finding it.
What?
You would get tennis balls.
Right. So what happened? Not because the CEO of one is smarter than the CEO of the other. It's how far down does it come into malchus. Okay. With this introduction, we are going to study this Maamer, which again was authored by the previous Rebbe, Rabbi Yosef Yitzchak, came to Chicago twice in 1929 and 1942. In fact, he was here when his mother, Rabbi Shana Sarah, passed away, and he had to take the train back to New York and so on. And he raises a question that is so obvious that it's called in Hebrew, in Yiddish, a klutz kasha. It's a question that's like a block of wood that you can't help but stumble over because it's staring you in the face. And this question, this is a classic form of Torah analysis, maybe it's a form of analysis in other philosophies as well. You take something that seems on the surface to be pretty harmless, and everybody's perfectly content to go on to the next page. You go, oh, not so fast. This makes no sense at all. You go, wow, this is totally ridiculous. And then you go, okay, that means that we have a completely different, or I would say even incorrect set of presumptions that we don't even realize that we had made. And we're going to dismantle all those presumptions and rebuild it from the beginning, which is what makes learning, on the one hand, very exciting, but also very challenging, because I got to blow up a lot of my presumptions. And that's why sometimes learning is a little more painful than we'd like it to be. So for those of you who have it at home, or I put it on the WhatsApp, it's the top page, the page number says page 10, and it's printed in the middle. And it just tells you in the sort of italicized print, Beis Samachdal means B'siyata D'Shmaya, with the help of heaven. This Maamer was taught on Beis the Rosh Hashanah, the second day of Rosh Hashanah, in Tufshin Gimel, which corresponds to 1942, 5703. So whatever, you do the math, a long time. So here we go. Adon Olam, Asher Malach, B'terem Kol Yitzur Nivra. That's the opening line of this quote from the davening. I hope everybody recognizes it. We sing it in songs. Adon Olam, Asher Malach. Now, what does this word mean? Master of the universe, who was the king, Melech, that's the term we talked about, prior to the formation of any creation. Okay, God was the king before anything roamed this earth, before there was an earth. So the previous Rebbe asked the overwhelmingly obvious question. The Tzarech La'avin. Our mission, the objective of this Maamer, is to understand this essential question. Eich yitochen ha-melucha. How can you have melucha? Now, melucha is that word that we don't have a good English word for, which is the verb form of the king. When the king kings, again, presidents preside, governors govern, kings king, whatever that is, what the action of the king. How can there be authority b'terem kol yitzur nivra, before you have formed any matter? Now, this calls to mind, and again, I don't mean it to be silly, like a child who decides, I'm the king. He has all his toys lined up, and he says, I'm the king. And he is, because no toy can move other than what the child compels it to do. But of course, that's not a king. What is the concept of a king? These words are real precise. So what does it mean that he was the king over what? It's like they say, on the first day, God said, let there be light. And there was light. There wasn't anything, but you could see it. What does it mean that God is the king over all before anything is created? How can you be king? Now, the word king is, amongst all of the Spherus that we talked about, is absolutely a relational term. That is, you can't be a spouse if you're not married. You can't be a parent if you don't have children. You can't be a sibling if you don't have siblings. And you can't be a king if you don't have subjects. Now, you could be kind even if there's no one to be kind to. If I think of myself as a kind person, that means that that's my nature. It doesn't mean that I'm doing kindness. If I think of myself as an orderly person, it doesn't mean I'm doing something orderly at this exact moment. When we say that someone is a king, that means there has to be subjects. You can't be a king without subjects. And what we mean by the term subjects is very specific. As will in my silly analogy, and the Maamer will flesh this out even more so. A child can't be a king over his toys. So the Friedrich, the previous Rebbe explains. The haloi called in hamalucha. What is malucha? What does it mean that you are king? It's al hazulas v'hanifra dafka, over somebody else. Now, to credit Alan Dershowitz says in his he talks about the Rebbe. He says the Rebbe has no power and ultimate influence, meaning the teacher can get the kids to do what he tells them, because if they don't, he's going to fail them. So he has power. But of course, as soon as he's not the teacher anymore, the kids don't listen to him. The dean has power and no influence, because he can either accept you into the school or not accept you. The wealthy person, he has power but no influence, as evidenced by the fact that once he sells his company, all of a sudden nobody calls him back anymore. The Rebbe has no power. He doesn't pay your salary. He doesn't pass or fail you. He doesn't get to say you can come into the synagogue and you can't come into the synagogue. And so he has ultimate influence. So we often confuse the two. That we live in a society where people want to talk about how many people they have to serve them. I got a guy to mow my lawn and drive my car. I got a guy to exercise for me. I got someone else to do it for me. Why? Because I somehow have power, if not influence. So a king, a true king, can only be a king over others. And again, he can be a king via power, because if you don't do it, he's going to put you in jail. Or he can be a king via influence, because the people voluntarily become committed to him. Now, I know the word king sticks in our throat like an allergy because of the bad experiences we've had in the West. And let's face it, in Torah, we didn't always have great experiences with kings. So a different term that might make it sit more simply is like a master, a person who comes to somebody, says, teach me to play the piano, teach me some skill. So there's got to be somewhat of a relationship between the two, but there also has to be somewhat of a distance between the two, as we continue. Well, for that reason, in order to truly be a king, it's only over subjects, not your children or your relatives. Why? Because your children are naturally predisposed to you. Your children are naturally predisposed because they're aligned with you. So they are not voluntary subjects, because what choice does the kid really have? That's at one level. And at another level, his intuitive impulse is to be connected with you. So in order to truly be a king, like we find by Avram and so forth, and again, the word king, I know it's a hard word for us to get our arms around because it's not something that we are accustomed to. But that quality is not about who I can force to do what I want them to do because I am more powerful and so on. It's who will voluntarily be in this type of connected relationship with him. So again, the child is not really voluntary. There are some essays that are written and some speculation about what was it like for the children of the Rabbeim, just from something that's a little bit closer to home. What is it like for them? Because you need a father and you need a Rebbe. We talk about it a lot on the holidays. We refer to Hashem as Avinu and Malkeinu, and it's a complicated relationship. We talk about Hashem as our father. That is, we have a natural, intuitive desire to be connected with Hashem. We think of the Father in the merciful sense, and we talk about Hashem as our King. that it's something that's not innate, it's not automatic, and it's not always born of a sense of closeness. It can really be born of a sense of reverence, distance, a sense of a longing to be close with something that's innately not part of my identity. So if a person has many children, that doesn't make them a king. And again, if we're willing to expand the conceptual idea outside of the literal monarch, in our broader society, there are people who have a lot of power, but it's not a king. And as evidenced by, once they can't hit home runs anymore, they're just some old fat guy. Once he sells his company, he's a has-been. But in the moment, he's, as we call it, the man. He really is. And it's a very challenging dynamic to be a king and not just a boss. The two are not identical, and they often get confused. And again, the fact that they have children doesn't make them a king, et cetera, et cetera. So you can say, even if a person had 1,000 children, and there is somewhat of this impulse, in our celebrity society, that he has 1,000 children and many relatives. That's not this term called king. And again, it's not just king, the noun, it's king, the verb, and it's king, the interactive relationship. We don't have words for that in English. So it's hard for us to translate it, but we get the idea. But that is only on the person who is the outsider. If your mother thinks you're cute, it's sweet and nice, and it may even be true, but it's not an objective reality. The capacity to persuade people who are not predisposed to your position is truly where influence lies, not innate connection, and certainly not what we call before power, in that sense that, I can get you to comply because I somehow have some authority over you. So that's the first question. What does it mean, A, to be a king? It means over those who are not innately predisposed to being an ally of yours. So they're not your children, they don't have a biological relationship, and they don't have any skin in the game. Meaning the vice president is always interested in the president because what makes him the vice president is that the president wins. Of course he wants the president to win because then he gets to tag along. So he's not truly a devoted servant of the president because he's got skin in the game. If he's the child, he's got a natural intuitive sense. And that is not a king. And again, our broader question, what does it mean that Hashem was king before he created anything? What is he the king over? What does that mean that he's the king if there's nothing to be the king over? King is like saying you're a parent, it means you have children. Saying you're a spouse, it means you are married. It's saying you are a sibling, it means you have a brother or a sister, and so on. So king means you have subjects. And again, as we talked about, not as the product of compulsion. Voidzos edition. Kinin hamalchus, huinin histaros, haba besibas nasnus, hamushreshes, remimis hanefesh. Now, this will offend our Western sensitivities because we don't like this, but we have it everywhere in America, in our Western society, everywhere except in politics, which is that there are certain people who have innate capacity. Now, that is rooted in the very essence of their identity. It's not the product of some accomplishment. It is simply they have an innate character. Now, we live in a society that tells people you can be whatever you want to be, which is false. So we have a bunch of people chasing a bunch of dreams that they're not cut out for. So the guy decided he wanted to be a concert pianist, but he doesn't have dexterity. A guy decided he wanted to be a doctor, but he can't follow the lecture on biology, and so on and so forth. But society, Western society, tells him, no, you can do it. You just got to work hard. You just got to outwork everybody else. It's false, because we all have, that doesn't mean you can't be what we would call successful. It means you have to find what is your character trait. What is your identity? Who are you? And that you can be. It's like sort of one of these like personality quizzes. How would you rate yourself on a scale of 1 to 10?
Are we looking for just one
Just one what?
of these character traits?
Not necessarily. We're looking to develop each of our characters.
Combination.
It's a combo deal.
I like
So if you ask somebody, how do you rate yourself on a scale of 1 to 10? The answer, again, in this perspective, is always going to be 10 because no one is better at being you than you are. But that's only if you are who you are. We live in a society where people want to model themselves after something that's not who they are.
Yeah.
But the concept of being a melech, which exists within all of us, is a distinctive characteristic that is innate in his personality. It's not something that can be necessarily taught. We just had it actually in the Haftarah this past Shabbos. This past Shabbos in the Haftarah, we have the story of David HaMelech, King David, is on his deathbed, literally. And he has a son whose name is Adoniah, who is asserting himself that he's going to be the next king. And, even if we took it at the highest ideal and saying, well, the king is dying, somebody's got to step up. So Adoniah is just trying to save the country, even if we took it at that. This does not sit well with Bathsheba because David HaMelech, King David, had promised her that her son, Shlomo, we call, of course, ultimately Shlomo HaMelech, is going to be the king. So she sets up this whole scenario where she has David affirm that Shlomo is going to be the king. Now, in this whole story that we read in the Haftarah this past Shabbos, we read about how Shlomo was the king and how David is the king. So we ask the question, this does not fly. You can't have two kings. You can't have a college of coaches. It's got to be, as Hashem told Moshe Rabbeinu, one person who is the decision maker. Buck stops here. So how could Shlomo be called the king when David is the king? So we explain that what David HaMelech, what King David was doing was he was identifying in the character of his son, he has the quality of king. It's not something that he earned. It's not because I like him better. He has this quality, just like a Kohen is a Kohen, not because he passed the test. It simply is embedded within his very neshama. So too, this characteristic of being king is imprinted within this neshama. And this king identifies the king characteristic within Shlomo. Now, this idea is rooted in the very essence of his identity, not because we taught him the court manners and not because he passed the test. It is identified. And we all have the characteristics that are identifiable within each of us. We tend to think of it because of I'm saying in Western society, we tend to think of it as what our job should be. And everybody's taking their 4-year-old to some guidance counselor to decide whether he should be an artist or an engineer. We a little overdo it, as we said, but it is true that everybody's got a natural proclivity. Now, here is the distinctive quality. The king is sort of like the policeman in the sense that, not that he polices the neighborhood, but the quality of the policeman is, as the story goes, but the policeman, who shoots the bad guy. And now he goes to the psychologist and he says, I don't want to be a policeman anymore because I don't want to shoot people. So he says, well, that's why we want you to be the policeman, because we don't want people who want to shoot people. We want people who don't want to shoot people. So to be king and to have the quality of king evoked within the person has to come from what is known in Kabbalistic terminology, which we will introduce here into our vocabulary of words, is the rusa de la sata. That is, it has to come from the people. The people have to petition him to want to be the king. They evoke that quality. Because again, if it's top down, if it's I'm the king because I said so, and I have the guns to enforce my rules, then you have a dictator. And in some circumstances, that's necessary. I have a friend, he's a school teacher for 30 years. He took a course in school teaching, and the teacher of the course said, you may be wondering, how do I establish my authority in the classroom? And he said, you're making a mistake. You already have the authority. The fact that you're the teacher means you have the authority, but you could lose the authority if you don't live up to it. That as you walk in, you have the authority, because if the kids don't behave, you could give them detention. You could fail them. You have power. We're not talking about power, we're talking about influence. And the two are similar, but markedly different. So this is the idea. How does that influence come? It only comes in response to the petition. And again, my bias absolutely acknowledged. This is how it worked with the Rebbeim. There were Rebbeim, for example, the previous Rebbe was the author of this Maamer. He was the only child of his father. From the time he was a teenager, even before, he was groomed by his father to succeed him in the communal work. So as soon as his father died, immediately he assumed the position. There was no question about it. It was seamless. When he passed away in 1950, and he had at that point only two daughters, one daughter and her son and her husband were murdered. It was just his yahrzeit this past week, were murdered in Europe. And there were two sons-in-law, Rabbi Gerari and the Rebbe. And people began to petition the Rebbe. They petitioned him. And got to the point, the Rebbe was like, it's not for me, and et cetera, until his wife said, you have no choice. How can you let my father's work just end? So the quality of Melech comes out from the petition of the people. It's not vastly dissimilar to this week's parsha, when Yitzchak, in his blind elderliness, suggests or begins the process of giving the blessing to his eldest son, until Rivka tells the younger son, Yaakov, you have a quality that you don't even know about. It's latent within you, but the circumstance beckons it forth. How do the people evoke this characteristic from the potential king? Well, think about it. If we went to a teacher, because I want to learn a skill, we went to some guy and we said, coach our football team. And he says, well, you're going to do what I say? No, of course not. We're not going to run laps or anything. He doesn't want to do it. Meaning, what is going to persuade him to want to give his attention to these people? Because they're going to listen to him. He doesn't want to fight with them. Because if he has to fight with them, now it's power, not influence. So what motivates him to accept the mantle of leadership is when the people say, we'll be devoted to you. Now, again, you sort of see where this is headed as far as the quality of Rosh Hashanah. This is what our objective is on Rosh Hashanah, as we will see. So when the people petition the king, or again, what our context is going to be, that we petition Hashem, and we say, we want you to be our guide, our leader, our melech. What is going to motivate him is we're going to do what he says. Who wants to fight with everybody? Now, to interject here, because the context is going to help give us understanding of the details. We say that on Rosh Hashanah, our goal is to persuade Hashem to once again be our king. Right? This is our goal. It's like the contract ends on Erev Rosh Hashanah, and on Rosh Hashanah, we persuade Hashem to once again take the job. Now, we might ask two questions. What would happen if we didn't do it? So then God's not in charge anymore? B, why would God want to be king? He's God. I mean, the governor doesn't want to be the mayor. The mayor doesn't want to be the alderman. It's a demotion. So what does it mean that we are asking God to be king? And what if we don't ask him? So then he's not in charge anymore? So we explain, as we have talked about here, that when we say he's king, we mean there is a relationship, there is a devotion of the king to his people, like the mentor, the coach, the teacher, the instructor, not just the king, like we think of some fat guy, chowing down on a lamb chop while he abuses the proletariat. So if we don't ask Hashem to be king, he's just in charge, but then he's the dictator. And he doesn't want to be the dictator. He wants to be in that kind of personal, interactive relationship with us. And that's why Hashem is, and I'm using the term, willing to demote himself to just be king. I mean, he's God. He's the king of kings. Why does he want to be king? So how does this achieve? This is achieved through us. So now let's again keep in mind the opening line of the Adon Olam that says that he was the king before there was anything. So if there was nothing to ask him to be king, it's like, how can you be a parent if you don't have children? And then you get another question. In order to consider Hashem, in order to consider somebody the king, it has to come from those who are in the same general genre that petition him, meaning the kid who wants to pretend that he's the king because he lined up all his toys is like the person who says, I'm the king because I run a zoo, I caged all the lions, and I'm the king because I trapped all the lions. Again, that's power, not influence. That is not what it means when it says it's a king. In order to be a king, it has to be somebody who is not compelled to obey you, doesn't have to do what you said. You don't have any power over him. And he comes to you voluntarily and says, will you teach me? Will you guide me? Will you devote yourself to me? And I will devote myself to you. And that's why he'll want to do it. Otherwise, who wants to be the king of a bunch of people who don't listen? But an animal, who's not in the category of the person, and he's not comparable, he is not going to arouse that power. I know a guy who has a very elaborate aquarium. I mean, he's put thousands of hours and tens of thousands of dollars into it. And because this is the character of our relationship, and I'm not essentially a very nice person, I tell him, well, this is your God complex. You like to pretend that you can control this. You created this, you design it. The fish are completely dependent upon you. They have no way to get food other than your compassion and mercy. And so this is your God complex. Then I usually run pretty fast because you can't catch me. That's not a king. And again, like I keep referencing, you can get a whole bunch of people to obey you because you'll pay them, or you'll withhold payment from them, or you'll fail them, or whatever it is. It's not a king. And you certainly can't be a king over animals because it's not a relationship there. Even if you'll own a zoo with thousands of animals, like Noach. I mean, look at Noach. Noach ran the ark. He had all of the animals in the world, literally, under his authority. They all were dependent upon him, but it wasn't the quality of Malchus. He was their servant. All he did was feed them. And there's that medrash about the time he didn't feed the lion, and the lion struck him, and so on. So he's not the king. He's the zookeeper. It's not the same, even though it might feel like it's the same. It might feel like it's the same. Everybody wants to come to my house. Sure. You're giving them a free party, they'll come. You stop giving them free party, they ain't coming anymore. All that is domination. You can dominate the animals. Like it says in the beginning of Torah, that Hashem told Adam and Chava, you will dominate the animals. You will dominate them, but they will not be a relationship of a king and subjects. Again, it might feel like it is temporarily, but it's not. It's no different than the powerful who dominate the weak. The powerful dominate the weak, but they're not the king. They think they are. But it becomes ridiculous when the person conducts himself as if he's the king when he's really just a bully. V'hagam kibet tabi yitzirasa. Hine HaKadosh Baruch Hu would be a kaiser chazak yeser. And here's the irony: an animal is naturally a stronger being than a person. That's why we're all amazed by the lion tamer. Oops, sorry. That's why we're all amazed at the lion tamer, because the lion is naturally more powerful than the person. And the person subdues the lion and he puts him in the cage and the whip and the chair and the whole bit. So you might think, oh, I'm the king over the lions. But I can't be, because that lion doesn't really care about you. And if you didn't have the whip or the food or whatever the incentive is, he's not listening to you. And this is the mistake that we make. And again, I want to be distracted. Animals can be pleasant, they can be joyous, they can be fun, they can be scared, but they can't be virtuous or non-virtuous. We don't really have a good dog. We have pleasant dogs who are fun to be around, but they don't make ethical choices. Even though an animal is innately more powerful than a person, because of like the pasuk supports, as it says, there is much harvest of wheat when we can harness the power of the ox, which suggests that an ox, as we know, I mean, it seems rather obvious, is more powerful than a person. And that's why you can produce greater farm product. If, before tractors, they hooked up the ox to pull the plow. Nevertheless, so why is it? Why don't the animals take over? I mean, if all the lions decided to show up, they'd win. So how come they don't? Because Hashem has given the authority of animal control to people. I mean, it's actually, we have it in Torah where Hashem tells Moshe that the Yidden won't chase the nations out of Eretz Canaan as fast as they like, because if you do, you have abandoned property, and then the animals come in, and then you got and not just squirrels. God has granted human beings the capacity to literally put the fear of humans on the animal, but that's not malchus. Again, it's no different than the bully or the guy who pays everybody to come to his party. We live in a celebrity culture where people are talking about, I got invited, I'm going to this party and that party, and it's hopefully not something that we get sucked into, but it's something that the world finds very attractive, and people consider themselves to be, they sort of made it because they got invited to the party of the century. And the host of the party thinks that everybody loves them. But believe me, if they don't make that party next week, nobody's coming. And the Hashem puts the fear in the animal. Even though that animal could, of course, crush you. He fears the man. And again, you ever see, the 5'4" school teacher reprimanding the 6'6" student, and he says, yes, I'll do my homework. That's not that's power, not influence. Okay. And again, not only that, but a small child can lead a whole flock of sheep. Like we have the story with David HaMelech and so forth. Who are obviously much stronger than them. So again, that's power, not authority. That is not this idea that we keep referencing back to of melech and melucha, these words which in English, king, to king, kinging, kingliness, again, we don't have words for this in English that are all based off the same root word. All you have and what we described until this point is authority. I beat you into submission. I force you to listen to me. I bully you into it. That's why you can't have let me rephrase it this way. Every relationship in a structured system, whether it's a corporate system or it's a military system, is by nature an authoritative system. And that's why there can't be a non-abusive relationship, because the general always holds the power. So even if he just asks you to do him a favor, you don't really have the capacity to say no, because it's a power relationship in contrast to an influence relationship. So now we return to the question. So now we return back to the original question. We make a statement, Adon Olam, Asher Malach, B'terem kol yitzur nivra, master of the world, who was the king before he formed any creation. Well, how can you be the king if there's nothing to be the king of? It's like saying, they tell a joke about this wealthy man, and he sees all his compatriots are wealthy, and they go to the yeshiva, and they tell the head of the yeshiva that they want a son-in-law, and then they bring him home, and he follows the father-in-law around, and he's always so solicitous of him, and so on. So this guy, I'd like to have that. So he goes to the yeshiva, he says, okay, I'm a rich man, give me a son-in-law. So they pull out the best guy in yeshiva. Okay. So the guy goes home with him. Day 2, 3. Finally, the kid says, okay, where's the girl? He says, I don't have any children. I just want to like sort of follow me around and, I want to play. And you think about, not us, of course, because we're perfect, but we could be subject to this, where we want to dress up and pretend that we have some influence or authority when it's really just made up. Yeah, if you pay people, they'll sit and pretend to listen to you. It's like a college professor once said, his job is to remember that all those kids in the class don't really think he's all that smart. They just want him to give them a good grade and write them a letter of recommendations. They can get into graduate school. But it goes to your head. You start to think, wow, I really am that smart, because all these kids sit around and think I'm that smart. I remember hearing from a high school principal that they always go in the summer to learning programs because they spend the whole year with teenagers who are highly motivated to make them, the teacher, think that they, the students, really consider them to be genius, that they start to think they are. So in the summer, they make sure to go to learn from other geniuses because it keeps them grounded. So this is our question. What does it mean when Hashem says that he was the authority, he was the king before he created anything? What is he the king over? It's like saying the guy, I have a son-in-law. Where's your daughter? I have a daughter. I just have a son-in-law.
That was Pinto's thing. He said his mother-in-law died before she had any kids.
He said, who is it again? Who is it that's soliciting him to be this authority? Because it has to come from the people. Who is it that's asking for it? Then nothing exists. And over whom is he malchusing? Who is he kinging over? Who asked him to be king, and who is he kinging over? It's a fantasy in his own mind. Should we stop here? Maybe we'll pick up next. Yeah. Okay, we'll stop here, and we'll pick up, God willing, next Tavach. Stop the recording. Okay, we'll email out the recording.